Hello, my name is Olivia Fleming, and I'm a senior art history and Spanish student at the University of Central Arkansas, and today I'm going to present my research titled Helen Zughaib's Syrian Migration series, examining the world's largest refugee crisis through art, which explores Helen Zughaib, who is a Lebanese American artist, and her Syrian Migration series, which she started in 2010. Her series is a form of artistic activism against the destructive byproducts of war and state-sanctioned violence in Syria, and strives to create awareness and empathy for Syrians. During this presentation, I will introduce you to the works of Helen as well as parts of the Arab uprisings, which will help lead into my discussion about her ongoing Syrian Migration series, which currently contains over 27 panels. By the end of this presentation, I hope you will all have a newfound interest in the Arab world and more awareness about the issues migrants, especially Syrian migrants, face. Helen Zughaib is a Lebanese American artist who lived in Beirut, Lebanon from her birth in 1959 until the Lebanese Civil War broke out in 1975. She has firsthand experience with war and violence and how those things can completely disrupt and destroy lives. Helen and her family fled Lebanon to escape violence, and at only 16 years old, she immigrated to France where she finished her secondary education in Paris. She then moved to New York where she got her Bachelor of Fine Arts degree at Syracuse University, and she now is currently working out of Washington, D.C. as a multimedia artist specialized in gouache. She creates art that focuses on Arab issues while simultaneously promoting ideals like healing, hopefulness, and spirituality. And so, on the left we see a self-portrait titled Map of Home, created in 2012. Across her, the shape of Lebanon overlaps her body, representing the importance of home and heritage. And she holds a paintbrush to her heart, which we all know signifies her identity as a painter. She also includes her cat named Stumpy, to whom she graciously gifted a tail. And on the right is a photograph of Helen in front of 4 panels from her Syrian Migration series. So now that you all know a little bit about Helen, I'm sure you're wondering a little bit why I discovered or how I discovered her works. Well, I developed interest in Helen's works during her visit at UCA in September 2019 when she was an artist in residence. She was part of a show at the Baum Gallery called Cultural Ties Sonia Clark, Joyce J. Scott, and Helen Zughaib, curated by Brian Young. During her visit, she hosted an artist talk where she discussed the significance of her works and briefly talked about the Arab uprisings, which are also sometimes referred to as the Arab Spring. I, like many of the students that attended her artist talk, had never heard of the Arab uprisings until she mentioned its significance in her more recent art. And I'm assuming some of you don't know what the Arab uprisings were, because I surely did not. I'm going to address this further, but basically the Arab uprisings were a series of almost spontaneous protests and revolutions that blew up during the later part of 2010 in the Arab world. And this was a result of political and economic injustice. So at the time, the brief introduction to the major political, religious, and social problems that occurred in numerous Arab countries ignited my concern for Americans' general lack of knowledge of or care for Arab issues. Many American people do not know much about the Arab world or issues, so due to people's unbeknownst ignorance, Helen must work diligently to portray and showcase her works concerning conflicts in Arab countries in order to bring awareness. Even my own ignorance disturbed me, particularly after viewing her colorful, bright works about millions of displaced peoples, death, starvation, and their desperation for hope and change. So viewing it felt paradoxical due to her juxtaposition between color and subject matter. And I asked myself, how could I remain so blind to such suffering? In the wake of ongoing crises in Syria, educating Americans on these vastly ignored Arab issues and Arab culture as a whole is necessary. So I decided to research the Arab uprisings through the lens of Helen's Syrian Migration series for my honors capstone project. Helen, who is one of the most beautiful, kind-hearted human beings I've ever met, helped me with this research through emails and interviews through Zoom due to the pandemic, but we made it work. This image is just a screenshot from one of our Zoom meetings, and the photo in the center was taken in September 2019 when she was in Arkansas. learned quite a bit through Helen, so I will try to summarize a year's worth of research in less than 20 minutes. The Arab uprisings, initially referred to as Arab Spring, began in Tunisia in December 2010, after masses of people finally snapped due to extreme poverty, lack of job opportunities, corrupt governance, and censorship. Tunisians protested and faced government-backed violence for less than a month when the president fled. And so for the first time in modern history, a popular uprising forced a ruler out of power. Egypt followed in Tunisia's footsteps, and they too ousted their corrupt leader. During the time of this painting's creation in early 2011, the masses of protests felt like a spring, as we see in this painting titled Arab Spring from 2011. The work depicts a woman, implied by the abaya that she wears, turned completely away from viewers seen against a yellow background, adorned in lush flora in an all-over pattern. Flourishing on and around the cloaked woman, the flower's vibrancy is intensified by the abaya's darkness. Helen's use of energetic pastel hues and the variety of flowers further reinforce her feelings attached to the work's title. Every flower, both in shape and color, is unique and visually pops next to the steadily weaving green vines. She evokes the sensation of the most colorful time of the year by using almost every color in the rainbow. At the time of painting Arab Spring, Helen felt optimistic towards the ongoing changes in the Arab world, especially what these changes might mean for the treatment of women. This period of passion and protest felt like a new revival for the Arab world, as Libya, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, Jordan, Morocco, Algeria, Oman, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Sudan joined the pursuit for change. The spring, however, ended. Numerous scholars have now rejected the term Arab Spring because it did not yield as much fruitful benefits as anticipated. The initial success of the uprisings fell short because various powers took advantage of the weakened political systems. Instead of the political, social, and economic change desired by so many desperate people, the Arab uprisings triggered some of the most horrific humanitarian crises in history. This painting, Spring Exodus from 2012, illustrates another woman in an abaya, but this time she spews out all her hope in the form of floral arabesque through a guttural wail. The reference to Picasso's Guernica also alludes to the sense of devastation and loss felt after the protests started to fall apart. And so, now we must ask, why are the Arab uprisings relevant to Helen's Syrian Migration series? Well, Syria was initially part of the Spring. The main trigger for issues in Syria started when police arrested and subsequently tortured 10 rebellious children aged around 15 years or younger because they had painted an anti-government slogan on a wall. Interestingly, these young activists borrowed the slogan "Down with the regime" from Egypt's revolution. For 2 weeks, these children's parents worked diligently to get their babies released, but when this failed, they decided to take their cause to the streets. Police then shot and killed several of the children's family members, and on the day of their funerals, 20,000 protesters began chanting anti-government phrases and attacking governmental buildings. And so the Syrian protests officially began on March 15, 2011. By June 2011, armed forces killed over 500 civilians. Syria soon developed into a battleground between the government, which was military-backed, and rebel groups, including the Islamic State, or as many Americans call them, ISIS, which essentially co-opted the Syrian People's Movement for Change. This painting, the first panel of Helen's Syrian Migration series, illustrates the indiscriminate violence in the beginning of war. The work reveals men beating each other on the street, mechanical objects, perhaps bombs exploding, and fire ravaging the city. The chaos conveyed in this first panel makes it clear that nowhere was safe, and that this was only the beginning of a devastating conflict. The constant destruction and violence resulted in an enormous Syrian migration. The United Nations Development Program discovered that 80% of Syrians inside the country were living in poverty. Their life expectancy had plunged by 20 years, and the economy had lost $200 billion since the conflict began. Because of these horrible factors, with no solution in sight, Syrians fled their home country. And so what was then known as the Promising Arab Spring too quickly became a humanitarian crisis so severe that the entire world acknowledged it. 13 million Syrians, which is half the country's population, fled their homes and mostly sought asylum in neighboring countries, including Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. Out of the 13 million, 6 of those are internally displaced peoples, meaning that they've lost their homes and have had to survive in refugee camps inside the country. This painting, panel 4 of her Syrian Migration series, depicts a group of refugees varying in age escaping Syria. The refugees watch several weaponized planes fly towards the direction that they likely just abandoned, as suggested by the baggage they carry. The group of figures remain turned from viewers, prohibiting us from assuming their psychological states. We do not know if they're relieved, scared, or both. But regardless, they have just given up their old lives in search for safety. Another important part of Helen's Syrian Migration series is how she adopts Jacob Lawrence's Syrian Migration series. Before starting her Syrian Migration series, she noticed some parallels between the refugee crisis in Syria and the resettlement of thousands of African Americans from the southern to the northern parts of the United States. In both cases, thousands of Syrians and African Americans have migrated to escape violence and to pursue better social, political, and economic opportunities. Jacob Lawrence, one of the world's most well-known African American artists, painted his migration series in 1941, which consists of 60 caption panels about the largest and most rapid mass internal movements of people in history. He depicted the journey and strife faced by approximately 6.5 million African Americans who left the South for urban cities like Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, and New York to escape the Southern sharecropping economy and Jim Crow laws. Helen based numerous panels of her Syrian Migration series on Lawrence's, as we can see here with her 14th panel and his first. You can see the stylistic similarities and differences. Helen obviously uses brighter, more pastel hues, whereas Lawrence used more earthy tones. And like Lawrence's first panel, crowds of migrants fill the train station, except they wear hijabs and fezzes and head towards Turkey, France, and Germany. Seeking asylum during a war is not always as easy as getting on a train. Many Syrian refugees have had to walk long stretches of land, pay smugglers to help them, and even travel by sea on makeshift rafts to cross national borders. This painting, panel 22 of her Syrian Migration series, depicts the dangers of the Mediterranean. The boat teems with passengers who must stand because there is no room to sit. The waves, although beautiful and blue, wash into the boat and consume the entire composition. Despite its visually pleasing colors and simplified form, the painting exudes a somewhat ominous sensation. We, as viewers, have to watch their struggle. One single figure looks out at us, and his little face says it all. They are in danger. His furrowed eyebrows and grimace provide a sense of fear and discomfort. The figure's lone face also grabs the viewer's undivided attention, a technique Helen often applies to evoke not only empathy, but curiosity as well. If she revealed all the faces of her figures, viewers would perhaps misunderstand her message by focusing too much on the tiny details. With only one figure revealing emotion, viewers more easily read the painting and apply the sensation felt by one to the rest. The concerned and definitely not cheerful face, combined with the pervasiveness of the waves, demonstrates the severity of their situation. Even if they reach the shore, then what? Years living in a dirty refugee camp? Years without financial stability? Years without human rights? Their future is highly uncertain. I thought it would be interesting to show this photograph taken in 2014 by Massimo Sestini, an Italian photographer, who captured this photo off the coast of Africa on the Mediterranean. The boat contains almost 500 people on it. When I initially found this image, I thought Helen used it as a reference for panel 22, but after talking to her about it, I learned that she actually painted panel 22 before ever seeing this photo, which reflects how prevalent this issue was. The last panel I'm going to show you is quite heartbreaking, and some of you may remember its reference. This is a painting created after a photograph taken of 3-year-old Aylan Kurdi, washed up on the shores of Turkey. Aylan's family fled Syria in 2015 on a small inflatable boat which capsized in the Mediterranean. Aylan, his mother, and his brother all drowned. The next day, Turkish authorities found his tiny body. A journalist captured the photo of the small boy, face down in the sand, which caught the attention of media outlets everywhere and globally sparked talk about Syria's refugee crisis. Helen, who was absolutely torn up by his death and the gut-wrenching image of his body, decided to recreate the photograph as part of her Syrian Migration series. Initially, she debated as to whether she should or should not recreate such a tragic and extremely real death, but she ultimately decided to, because this is the reality of war and immigration. In 2018, 1 in 14 people that tried to cross the Mediterranean drowned. Even with these statistics, refugees still gambled their own lives in pursuit for potential safety. This painting, panel 24 of Helen's Syrian Migration series, reveals the same beautiful yet violent waves from panel 22 crashing upon the shore where baby Aylan lies. His death, although accidental, should not have occurred. His family shouldn't have been forced to sail the open sea through smugglers. While many countries, mostly in the Middle East, have accepted Syrian migrants, the majority of the world has turned their attention elsewhere or capped the number of Syrian migrants allowed in their countries. And as we speak, Syrians are being deported back to Syria despite their still ongoing war. And so, Helen fights the hardest for people like Aylan Kurdi, the ones without voices, the innocent, the young. And these people still need and deserve safety. The future of Syria's displaced people is largely uncertain. However, what is known is the necessity for compassion, empathy, and understanding for the people unwittingly affected by tragedy. Helen continues educating about the world's largest refugee crisis and advocating for the safety of those affected through her art. Her Syrian Migration series, currently standing at over 27 panels, is ongoing. Lawrence's last Migration series panel proclaims, "And the migrants kept coming. And they will. As long as poverty, war, and political corruption exist, people will continue making dangerous journeys until they reach permanent safety, or perhaps just a place they can call home. Until then, their journeys, like Helen's series, will remain unfinished." Thank you.